Oh, and all the attendees are starting to roll on in here. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We're just getting all attendees on in here, so it might take a hot minute before you all load in, and then we'll get started. I see them all slowly trickling in here. Yeah, we're still going. Welcome, everybody. Happy Monday evening. Hopefully your Mondays were fantastic and not like a traditional Monday. I don't know how normal Mondays go.
Usually Mondays are busy for everybody, so hopefully it has been.
Best day, right? The best day of the week. Okay, it looks like we've paused with the attendees. Oh, no, we're still getting some. Never mind. They're still loading. All right. All right. So it should be, I think all the attendees are on in here. I'm going to pass it on over to Carlos. Carlos, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight for our virtual adult speaker series. I'm Carlos Hernandez, manager of in-person community programs here at the Exploration Place Museum and Science Center. We're located in Prince George, BC, and honored to live and work here on the traditional territory of the Lheidli First Nations people. I would also like to thank our media sponsor, CBC Daybreak North, for supporting this series. Tonight, I have Bailey Holloway and Jacqueline Baxter here to assist with tech support. And at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A speech bubble. Please post your questions there at the end of this presentation. I would like to welcome Dr. Catherine Nolin. Dr. Nolin is a professor and chair of the Department of Geography, Earth, and Environmental Sciences at UNBC in Prince George, British Columbia. In 2021, Dr. Nolin was elected to the College of Fellows of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. And according to the RCGS, fellows are individuals who have distinguished themselves by directly contributing to scientific knowledge in the field of geography, geographical exploration, or allied sciences. Dr. Nolin is a longtime researcher and social justice advocate for Indigenous and human rights, including more than 25 years grappling with afterlives of the Guatemalan genocides. Dr. Nolin has worked with Grahame of Rights Action for almost 20 years to organize and facilitate field schools to Guatemala for undergraduate and graduate students. Today, Dr. Nolin will talk about TESTIMONIO, Canadian mining in the aftermath of genocides in Guatemala, and also her official book launch, which is set for October 25th at 4 p.m. PST. On the Between the Lines Facebook page and YouTube. The book's also available locally at Books & Co, as well as the UNBC bookstore. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And now we'll pass things over to you, Dr. Nolin.
Well, thank you, Carlos and Jacqueline. And it's nice to see so many people joining us, and there may be more coming in. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for inviting me to the Adult Speaker Series. Thanks to Exploration Place and to CBC Radio for supporting this series and the work that we're doing. I'm really thrilled to be here. As Carlos mentioned, we have a book that's just about ready to come out. October 25th is the official launch after many years of work to get it to this stage. And I'll share with you some of that journey of getting the book here. But I did go down to Books & Company this afternoon and picked up a copy. So they are in town, and I'm really thankful that Books & Company and the UNBC bookstore will carry the books. So I wanted to begin, as Carlos did, by acknowledging that I'm coming to you, depending where you are in the world. I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Lheidli, where I live and work at University of Northern British Columbia here in Prince George. And I think it's really important to acknowledge where I'm coming from, and also the work that I've been doing for all of these many years takes place. And so I do want to acknowledge and share my respect for the Maya and Xinca peoples and their territory where we have done our work for so many years, and that I'll be sharing with you today. I really do think it's important to make these acknowledgements because our work that I'll be sharing with you is collaborative and done in solidarity with Indigenous land and water community defenders who over these last many years have been criminalized, attacked, imprisoned, some have been killed. This has all happened for their resistance to an imposed development model and plan where violence is used to implement these kinds of so-called development projects that I'm going to share with you. So Canadian mining companies have operated in Guatemala for several decades. And so I'll share some of that work with you. I think it's important to recognize that we do this work in solidarity and work towards justice and accountability. And that's part of what I'll be sharing with you today. So as Carlos also mentioned, with the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, with the College of Fellows, part of the role of fellows is to make Canada more well-known to Canadians and to those around the world. And I think part of my responsibility with the kind of research I do is to share what's happening with Canadian mining companies and Canadian investors, Canadian government officials, and Canadian policies and so on outside of our borders. It's something that many people aren't familiar with, and yet so much is done in the name of Canada and Canadian businesses. And so part of my responsibility as a fellow is to share that, and I'm really happy to do that today. So I will start sharing my screen because I think it's really important to share images and the voices of people with whom I've worked for the last almost 30 years. And so I want to share some of this with you as we go through. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I think Carlos can give me the thumbs up that it's visible and viewable. Great. Okay, thank you. So this is the cover of our book, which has the title Testimonio, Canadian Mining in the Aftermath of Genocides in Guatemala. And I'll try and pull some of that apart with you as we go through the talk tonight. I'll share with you the kind of the four main mining struggles that we documented in this book over the course of about 16 years or so, and the collaborations that have been critical to doing this kind of work. What does testimonio even mean? It's the voices of people to speak individually and collectively about experiences that they have gone through, usually violent experiences. And it's an important way to understand and learn what's happening on the ground, to value the voices of people who've experienced some of these things. What I also wanted to do, though, is not only talk about these violent events that have happened, which are important to understand and know, but also to share with you the inspirational work of people who are working to change these conditions. And I think that's an important part of what we do as well. And so I'll kind of wrap up with the call for the book, which is not only to document and clarify what has happened over the last many years, but also to give kind of a roadmap of what Canadians can do to change these conditions, what we might do after hearing a presentation like this, which can be somewhat overwhelming. So I will say that some of what I'm sharing, well, much of what I'm sharing is about violent events. So some of what I'll be talking about is quite graphic and difficult to listen to. And I want you to know that I'm sharing this on behalf of those and at the request of those who I've met with and interviewed and spent time with. And the images that you'll be seeing, the photographs as well, are photographs of people who've asked that their images and their names are used, which is sometimes different than how a lot of university research works, where sometimes places are given anonymous names or pseudonyms, and people are anonymous and maybe we don't know their names. But this is an important part of the work that we've done for so long. And so these images and names are used with their permission. Here is our book, and the website from Between the Lines Press is up and running. And I'm really proud to share with you that Between the Lines book has kind of come to the rescue of this book after a long and winding journey that I'll share with you kind of as we go along. I'm really happy that it's with a Canadian publisher, as Canada really is the global mining powerhouse, and it's important to publish this in the place where that's going on so that we can start looking critically at what's around us. Let's put that all up. So let's start with the big picture. Many of us, myself included, I worked in Guatemala for many years, since 1992, but it was not until 2004 that I realized the way in which Canadian mining companies operate kind of around the world and started reoperating in Central America and Latin America more generally. I think a lot of us know that there's a lot of mining going on in Canada itself, but I don't know if many of us knew the extent of kind of the reach of Canada in terms of the global mining picture. And so something that I think is useful to know, I would say, is that more than half of all the public listed exploration and mining companies in the world are headquartered in Canada, which is roughly about 1,500 companies that operate across about 100 countries. Maybe even more importantly is actually that about 3/4 of the capital, the equity capital that's raised globally for the mining industry, is raised on the Toronto stock exchanges. And so Vancouver and Toronto are really the hubs of raising capital for the global mining industry. And there's lots of reasons for that we might get into later. But when I started hearing about Canadian mining companies starting to operate, starting to request exploration licenses and so on in Guatemala, I really had no idea of kind of the global reach of the industry. But we start putting the pieces together, and I think it helps put this one story I'm going to be sharing with you of one country into a bigger picture. And so what I'll be sharing with you is what we might call transnational plunder. And so through 4 illustrative cases that we document in the book, and I'll share some of each of these with you tonight, 4 main mining companies that have operated in different parts of the country. And so if we look at who they are, the 4 main companies, the first one being Sky Resources, which eventually sold to Hudbay Minerals, operated and has now sold their company to a Russian company, actually, a nickel mine in the north and east of the country. Hudbay Minerals is based out of Toronto. Goldcorp and their Marlin mine is off in the western part, western highlands of the country. And Goldcorp, some of you, in British Columbia may recognize Goldcorp's name as a major gold mining company based in Vancouver. Radius Gold and their La Puya, well, the La Puya resistance to their mine is kind of close to Guatemala City. And then in the kind of the south and east of the country is a silver mine called the Escobal mine, which was owned by Tahoe Resources out of Vancouver and has somewhat recently been sold to Pan American Silver. So these are the 4 main cases. And the reason I call this transnational plunder is not only related to the violent ways in which these companies have operated that we've documented in lots of different ways in this book. But the mining law in Guatemala changed to really entice a lot of these companies to show up and start investing in the country. And the mining law was changed to make it so that only 1% of profits remain in the country. So 99, in addition to the resources, the nickel, the gold, the silver, and so on, leaving the country, 99% of the profits leave the country and come to Canada. 1% is divided between kind of the national level and the local region. And many communities, Indigenous communities in this region, have actually said no thank you to that, that part of that 1%. So what we're seeing not only is that people have not been consulted about the establishment of these concessions and later the mines, but they're also, I would say, at the kind of the losing end of the transnational plunder. So when I talk about the kinds of experiences that we documented in the book, what we're talking about is not insignificant. I think what we're talking about, and I think some of the people who are probably listening in online have done work in this region as well, and maybe on these issues in particular. What we and many organizations and individuals in Canada and in Guatemala have spent the last couple of decades really documenting mining-linked violence of all sorts, including murders, assassination attempts, homes being shot at, homes being burnt down, violent evictions that take those forms as well through shooting at communities, from helicopters, from bringing the troops in, 800 troops to bring in and evict people from their homes. Well documented, I think, are also the environmental and health harms. So the kind of health harms being things like contamination of water sources that lead to skin irritations, illnesses, the death of animals, and environmental harms that are not repaired, of course. And I show these four folks here who their testimonios, their voices are included in the book, including on the left, Theodora Hernandez, who is on the cover of the book, who was violently shot in the eye by a mining company related thug, I suppose, and is still alive today, thankfully, but has been in resistance to selling her land to Goldcorp, for example. The two men in the middle, Miguel Angel Bamaca and Alfredo Perez, both faced all sorts of criminalization attempts, what would you call them, abductions and forced detentions, and for their vocal resistance to the Goldcorp mine. And Aniceto Lopez on the far side in the kind of the check shirt, who himself as well is included in the book and as a major defender of water and land and Indigenous rights. And I think it's really important that their voices are at the center of explaining to us what is happening on the ground. So the title of the book is called Canadian Mining in the Aftermath of Genocides in Guatemala. And I won't go into a ton of detail about the genocides, but just a thumbnail sketch to explain that back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, what was an internal armed conflict escalated to what then became documented as a series of genocides of Indigenous people and mass violations of those resisting the state in the 1980s and 1990s. The United Nations had a truth commission that came out in 1999 and stated that genocide had taken place in 4 different parts of the country against 4 different Indigenous Maya communities. And so that was really the work that I was doing before kind of mining came on my radar. I work with communities to document the refugee flight out of this region and the refugee return back to the homes of their ancestors, even when the conditions were still extremely challenging. And so I've tried over the years to try and understand that spatial expression of military strategies and how violence was played out through the state, through the military and the police and death squads, different state forces. But while I was doing this work, along with many people that I've collaborated with over the years, we didn't really realize that conditions were changing on the ground with those who kind of benefited from that genocide. So the kind of the elite of the country and their allies, which changed the conditions of the country, that opened it up for foreign investment. So to move on from a country that was majority Indigenous to one that would be open for development in many forms, and mining is just one of them. So what I would say is now what we're looking at is really the legacy of genocide, that the genocide created the conditions where nobody has been held accountable, almost nobody has been held accountable for the crimes of genocide and mass atrocities and so on. That legacy led to the opening up of the country for foreign investment, and Canadian mining companies moved in a big way. And that all really began in the early 2000s. And so the last years, since 2004, I've worked with many people, including Grahame Russell of Rights Action, to document the violence of Canadian mining so-called development. And we do this in lots of different ways, but I think the most important part is that we have a collaborative approach to look at these contemporary human rights struggles. And so we work with graduate students, undergraduate students from UNBC and lots of other universities. We work with journalists and photographers, documentary filmmakers, lawyers, artists, community members, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, human rights organizations. I think it's really important that we all kind of add our skills and work collaboratively together to actually move these issues forward, to work for really positive change. And so part of doing this is to gather testimonies of people in their communities. And so some of the images you see here are us doing that in different ways, whether we're in groups with a whole community to listen to what has happened to them and what they want to share with us, to document this violence, whether it's through doing interviews or just listening to communities, whether it's doing video and recording, to work with journalists and so on. So to document this in lots of different ways, and then try and understand how this continues, how it's not just one-offs, but it's actually structural violence kind of embedded in the way in which the state operates. And that's how we have to work to try and change these things. So I wanted to put, I gathered these images today of many of the people who have contributed to this work and to the book. All of these people have contributed either their artwork, their research, their really their passion to work for positive change. And many of the people are based in Guatemala, live in Guatemala, from the Indigenous communities most affected to other people we work with across Canada. And so I won't name everybody, of course, because there are so many, but I did want their faces here so that you recognize that none of this happens individually, that collaboration is the way forward. So the two images I have here, one is from a church in one part of Guatemala that experienced really difficult experiences during the genocide. And so many people have fled this region now. And so this is a mural that's on a kind of a church wall. And so this tension, I guess, or the connections that we're trying to make clear is that we're not writing, and we didn't go about writing a book about mining violence and how mining is bad just to say that mining is bad. Mining isn't always bad, but it is bad in this context. And we wanted to really root it in the contemporary moment, which is the communities really trying to move forward in a positive way these now couple of decades after the genocide, even when justice has not come for them, when nobody really has been held accountable for those crimes. And yet now they continue to face new challenges, like, for example, the bottom picture which is the Marlin mine, previously owned by Goldcorp out of Vancouver. So they're communities that are dealing with many struggles, and we've tried to work in a positive way to document that and hopefully work to change these conditions. So part of gathering testimonio, so more than just testimony, like individual accounts of what happened, but to get at the community experience of what has happened when faced with Canadian mining companies kind of showing up in their territory, often unannounced to them anyways, is to get out on the land, to meet communities where they are, which is usually on the land and in their communities. And so we're often invited, always invited, so that's how we end up working with these communities, to be invited in, guided in, walked into the communities as people who they want to share these experiences, not because, this group of university students, for example, in this picture from UNBC, are experts in this field, but they understood that we would work with them to amplify their voices, to respond to their requests, to take their words to the Canadian government, the Canadian embassy in their country, to policymakers, decision makers, and that we might amplify their voices. And so that has been a really important responsibility for all of us. And really the book, in a way, is an outcome of that request the main request is to get this monster out of here, to get these companies out of here, no matter which way we did it. I don't know if we've succeeded in that so much, but we have certainly worked to clarify what's happening and try and change the future conditions. So testimonio means, listening more than asking. I won't be sharing with you like a list of questions I asked community members about their experiences of violent evictions or these mining violences or what's going on with the water and so on. It's often being with them and just being willing to listen and to come back, right? So these are not one-off moments usually, that it's about sitting with people on their land, like this picture with Diodora and Aniceto. Or the picture on the bottom is with a family who lost one of their young sons who worked for the Goldcorp mine and was killed in one of the underground tunnels about a month before we met with them. And we wanted to make known that was another kind of violence when people are forced or feel forced to work in these situations because of impoverishment and lack of opportunities and so on. And part of testimonio as well is artistic expression. And so the image that's in the top left, the painting, is by Patty Flores, based in Toronto, who's a Honduran Canadian who, through her artwork, shares some of the images of the people who are most at the forefront and working to get their voices out. I wanted to share this image because I think it's an important one that I see. I'm the one sitting, and Maria Chok is a major Indigenous rights defender, community defender, who often serves as a translator for us when we are meeting with community members in her part of the country, around the nickel mine in the kind of the north and east of the country. And I see her as the teacher to us of what is going on the ground, that I'm not arriving as an expert on Canadian mining operations in this region and telling them what's what. I mean, they are the ones who are experiencing this. We're there to learn and take direction from them. And this research, which has been called in the Indigenous methodology kind of literature of how to do this kind of research, would be called like insurgent research. You are there at the request of the community members, you take your direction from them, and all of the work, or most of the work, is directed back to them for their benefit. And so here Maria is showing me the stack of papers that she's having to deal with because she's been charged with some major crimes for standing up for her community, and she now must return to the regional courthouse every month until her court case comes up, which is supposed to be happening in November. And she's saying, look at this, this is another form of violence where companies can tie us up in the legal system and keep us from doing the work that we need to be doing with our communities. It sometimes means sitting in communities and listening to the whole group, where maybe they select 1 or 2 or 3 representatives who speak on behalf of the whole community to share with us what has happened. And this case was one that I think stands out for many of us who've worked on these issues. A community called Lote Ocho, which I'll share a little bit more with you in a few minutes. But they requested that we come into their community back in 2010, and we have kind of accompanied them in their journey to hold the Canadian company Hudbay Minerals accountable for the crimes and violations that happened in their community earlier than that, so in 2007 and 2009. So they asked us and set us up in front of the community, almost like a panel, to hear their words. And so it takes time, right? When we're working in many different languages, many different Indigenous languages, and Spanish and English. And so it takes patience and a lot of listening, which I think is really important. So our book, what is the main takeaway message of our book, Mining in the Aftermath of Genocides in this country? This is an image of the Hudbay Minerals mine on the shore of Lake Isabel, the largest lake in the country that leads out into the Caribbean coast. I think one of the main takeaway points is that it is not possible to operate a large-scale mine in this country, let alone all the other big large-scale economic so-called development projects that range from banana plantations, sugarcane, African palm plantations, major hydroelectric dam projects, a lot of for export production of these crops, as well as garment sweatshops in the cities and so on. All of this is happening, overlapping in a country that's still reeling from the genocide and trying to really move forward in a positive way. We say it's not possible to operate a large-scale mine or these other activities without participating in and benefiting from human rights violations, benefiting and participating in repression, benefiting and participating in corruption and impunity. And that kind of statement, I don't say lightly, because you need to have some pretty solid evidence for all of that. And I think the work that we've done with journalists on the ground, lawyers, legal teams, and so on, I think we're confident in what we're saying, that this is a statement that's an outcome of about 16 years of working on these issues. So that's kind of the takeaway. When we look at this map here, I wanted to give you a sense. This was a map created back by an organization called Madre Salva, a non-governmental organization, environmental organization, back in 2004. So this was the very beginning of when we started hearing about mining activity ramping up in this region. So this is a map of points where in the country where there were requests to do a little bit of exploration, requests to do exploitation, like actually getting the mines going, requests just for reconnaissance and so on. Basically, what I'm wanting to show you is that this is those dots on the map of all those requests overlap with the colored sections, which is really the Indigenous peoples of the country, the parts of the country where the majority of the population is Indigenous. We could also overlap on this map pretty much the same regions were where during the genocide, the massacres, the forced disappearances, the major violations of human rights and so on happened in these same regions. So we're seeing an overlap of Indigenous territory and continued violations that are overlapping. And so I think this is important part of the context that we're talking about modern mining, but on land that has been home to Maya peoples for millennia. In this book, I wanted to share with you as well that at the beginning of the book, we do document and really try to outline some of the contours of what happened in the genocide. And we've done that not only through some journalistic and academic studies that are included, but also the testimonial, the voices of people like this man here, Sebastian Iboy Osorio, who we worked with for many years as a survivor of a set of massacres where he really lost almost everyone in his family and his community. And I think it's important that we hear the voices of people who've lived through that, in addition to those who are dealing with contemporary issues of mining. And one of the contributors and collaborators in this project is a documentary photographer named James Rodriguez, and his work runs through the book and is on the cover of the book as well. And I'm really grateful for the collaborations with James over the years. So here's just a very basic map that shows the four main mining struggles that we have documented, from the Marlin mine, the Phoenix project up in the north and east, the Escobal mine going towards El Salvador and Honduras, and then a mining struggle called La Puya, just outside of Guatemala City. So what we started documenting, and I think what's at the heart of the book, of looking at the Canadian government's support of what's happening on the ground with Canadian mining companies, or Canadian-based mining companies, isn't what's called, or became called, an extractives approach to development, where the Canadian government really put a lot of effort, money, resources, time, energy to support an approach that said, countries like Guatemala are going to only benefit and move on from the challenges of the past by focusing on the extraction of natural resources. And wow, Canada just happens to be the major mining company, location in the world. And so we're going to be there for the communities. We're going to be there to make sure that the extractives industry grows and thrives, and will be there. And very quickly, what we found, and these images here demonstrate it, these are images taken from 2007. So the companies were only starting to arrive in about 2004. And quickly, we started seeing what an extractives approach to development meant. It meant that that the Canadian government, through policies and actions of the embassy and so on, supported the Canadian mining companies kind of at all out, no matter what was happening on the ground. And what we saw on the ground through the work of, again, our friend and colleague James Rodriguez and other folks, journalists and documentarians on the ground, were massive troops being called in, military, police, private security, to come in and burn down people's homes that overlapped with the concessions that were given to the mining companies. So the mining company was able to indicate that these folks were squatters on the land and needed to be removed. And we've seen this pattern play out since that time. We were so shocked after learning and being with the community of La Teocho that's just kind of up the mountain from these sets of communities that are shown here in these images. After meeting with them and them explaining what happened to their community of the gang rape of women in the community, of their homes being burnt down, shot by helicopters, from helicopters. 800 troops were staged and came up into their small community again to try and get rid of them. And so the images here are the group that I had with me in Guatemala at that time, mainly students from UNBC actually. And we worked to write a formal human rights violation complaint. And again, that was kind of the beginning of this documenting of crimes and violations across many different struggles. But we submitted this to the Canadian Embassy, Canadian Foreign Affairs, and waited for a response, and we're still waiting for a response. So you need to take other strategies. Highlighting what was going on didn't seem to work. And so other strategies, like a legal strategy of holding them accountable legally, became the way in which we had to move. So we've returned, of course, many times in the years. We do this on the ground, as I've shown you. Sometimes we end up in the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court of Guatemala, where cases are being brought forward to say, we need to put these mining operations on hold until the community's voices can be heard, until proper informed consent can happen. And so the legal strategy becomes very important. Being with people on the ground, people are choosing different strategies. And so we've documented at the Escobal mine, the silver mine, all sorts of faces of resistance, men and women who are, for example, in this case, blocking the road for mining equipment and so on, because again, no consultation had ever taken place. And this actually, I think, was a worthwhile strategy, because the company has now been forced by their own government, by the Guatemalan government, to undertake a proper consultation, and that's starting to happen now. The Gold Guatemalan mine is the other one I've shown you, and this one is a case where the gold mine has opened and now closed. So we've documented it from opening till closing. And there's almost no good story here to tell, other than major profits were made by Goldcorp themselves. And every struggle of every community resistance to this mine met a dead end. And so I think the only wonderful story out of this is that people feel like at least we resisted it. We resisted it all along. And they served as an example for other communities around the country of how to stand up for your rights and resist, even if it's not successful. Another case we document, one of the four, is a mining site of Radius Gold that a peaceful resistance has taken place. It's now more than 6 years. I should change that on the slide. They have been on the side of the road blocking the entrance to this mine site since 2012. The graphic on one of the walls in this roadside resistance says, "We're all La Puya," meaning they have really captured the imagination of people concerned about these issues within the country and beyond, to say we're all in this kind of struggle together and face excuse me, face really difficult experiences of criminalization, of riot squads, excuse me, being brought in, and excuse me, violent evictions. I've mentioned this one before, Lote Ocho, the community that we worked with for many years. And so we've tried to document that, their experience over time as well. So in this context of mining in a time of impunity, I think what we can be clear on is that the Canadian government and our companies are continue to choose to do business in this country that not only is known for the issues of corruption, impunity, and lack of democracy, but that they are contributing to that corruption, impunity, and lack of democracy and profiting from it. So it's not that it's unknown, they're choosing to work in this context and contribute and benefit from what's going on there. This image here is an image of those who were disappeared during the time of the genocides, where it says, you know, how many more years of this impunity? How long does this continue to go on when those earlier major crimes, war crimes, have not been dealt with, and now we're dealing with new crimes? In our book, I think we would really make the case that there are many violations that we've highlighted, but I think the beginning, the foundational violation is that Canadian mining companies are moving in and operating with a complete lack of free, prior, and informed consent before mining development, and contributing to what we might call, you know, transnational impunity. I just wanted to end with a few other images here to give you this context of what it means when Canadian mining companies open up in your region. In Latin America, as I mentioned before, about 75% of the mining companies operating all through Latin America are Canadian controlled or Canadian based. And what we see over time, this graphic is from an organization called Global Witness. And what they were trying to document was that, like, this context of opening up mining operations in Latin America and elsewhere. The context really is this increased competition for control of land and natural resources in many different countries in the world, and highlighting the way in which Indigenous communities, and women in particular in these communities, are made vulnerable by this intense competition for control of these resources. And so what Global Witness, when they were producing this report where this graphic came from, highlighted that a couple of years ago, that in the country of Guatemala saw the sharpest increase of killings of environmental activists, 5 times as many in 2018 as in 2017. So this context of violence is intensifying and increasing. And when we look at in the graphic, the sectors where this is happening, it's not only in mining and extractives, it's throughout many different areas, but the extractive industry is at the forefront of this violence. And so we tried to get this book out. I think I began by saying I'm really thankful for Between the Lines Press out of Toronto to publish our work, because we had originally submitted this book to another publisher, and we're just about ready to publish it in 2020, when at the very last moment, the publisher sent us a termination contract and said that they couldn't publish the work because it was full of all sorts of unsubstantiated content and was defamatory to many mining company operations and so on. And they wouldn't move forward. We were pretty positive that we had strong conclusions, but that we did not have anything defamatory included, and that we were very careful with how the book was written and the evidence that we were presenting. And so we kind of pushed to find out what was really going on. And We don't know that much, but one thing we do know from the publisher is that they said that a third party would sue them if they published our book. But it wouldn't tell us who the company was or what they said was defamatory. We got no information at all, which is very strange for a publisher to do that. So we said we had to do this because it's not so much that it was kind of a violation, accusing us of these things, which was not good, but it was just another example of how the Canadian media, the Canadian public is not informed of what is actually happening, that there's a silencing of these kinds of stories, that we do not see them. And this was another example of this kind of information not being made accessible to people who should know about it. And so we kind of made a big stink about it, I guess you would say. We made a public statement and we were supported by the Canadian Association of University Teachers, which is like the union of kind of all university faculty across the country. And they supported us by putting our book through a full libel review. They paid for that, which is a major financial obligation. And one of the top libel lawyers in the country read the manuscript from start to finish and indicated there was not a single instance of defamatory or unsubstantiated content that would stop the publication. And so he encouraged others to consider publishing the book, and Between the Lines came forward and did that for us. So the beginning of the book, we have a section now we open the book with the story of that journey, of the story that can't be buried, that we had to move forward so that these what we were trying to publish would get published. And so it's full of about 8 chapters, full of lots of different voices, lots of different images that talk about both the genocide, the legacy of genocide, and the 4 main mining struggles. And then there's a section at the end where we focus on legal accountability and work with some of the lawyers who are working on these cases to highlight the importance of that. So I might just end with a couple of points here of what we can do about this, because I think we're pretty close to the end of our time. I think for those of us who are interested in this, some of the things that we can do to change these conditions. One is, of course, to name Canadian mining impunity and document it. And so working, reading a book like ours or paying attention to organizations that do this kind of work, like Mining Watch Canada or the Mining Injustice Network of Toronto and others. But to name it, know it, and document it. The other call we have with this book is a real push so that we would have change or adopt a legislative framework in Canada that would hold companies and any state agencies criminally and civilly legally responsible for abuses. So it's almost impossible for Canadian mining companies to be held accountable in Canada for crimes that are committed elsewhere. So in the case of Guatemala, the Canadian legal system would usually say the crimes happen in Guatemala, go to the Guatemalan justice system and legal system and deal with it there. But we have worked with some amazing lawyers. The communities have worked with amazing lawyers working pro bono to bring some of these cases into the Canadian courts, both in British Columbia and in Ontario, to hold Hudbay Minerals and Tahoe Resources civilly, so in civil cases, accountable for what's going on. We still cannot hold them criminally liable for major crimes and violations. But that's something that I think a lot of organizations in Canada who pay attention to these issues are calling for that. The other is to make companies not just, saying that they can voluntarily comply with legal and human rights norms, that it should be mandatory. So a lot of mining companies and others have things called corporate social responsibility documents to say that they're really supportive of human rights and they'll work their best to do the right thing. But all of that is simply voluntary. Company is not held legally accountable for that at all. And so I think there's a big push in the need to say we need mandatory compliance, not just voluntary. One of the other points that we've tried to make is that Canadian government, both financial and diplomatic support, so like through the Canadian embassies in these countries, that should be dependent on compliance with legal and human rights norms. So when major violations are brought to the attention of government officials who are supporting these companies, that support should cease until there's clarity and that they're backing compliance with the law. That's not what has happened in the past. So corporate social responsibility policies are just not enough. We cannot say that companies can, comply if they want to, and if they don't, well, they should do better. That's really not enough. And I think there are lots of organizations around the country and in this region who would agree with that, I think. And so I'll just end with this one slide. It didn't pop up here, but what is land? I think at the heart of all of what we've looked at is this question of struggles over land. How do we value land and how do we value different ways of thinking about land? So is land a natural resource to be exploited? Is it your home? Is it property, right? There's been a whole transformation of land into property to be bought and sold. Many people in the communities we work with in and around these mines talk about the land as being their mother, the honey of their lives. And that is why they're in resistance to an extractives approach to development, that this is a violation of their mother. Is it for sustenance for the people who live in this region, or is it to create export out of the country? Is land for life or is it for profit? I think what we've documented is that this is a major struggle. It's not going to change anytime soon, but I think there are many people who are working to change the balance and to figure out better ways forward. So I think I'll leave it there, Carlos.
Hey, awesome presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Nolin. Well, it was very interesting. Well, now we have between 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers from our audience. And please, if you have any questions, just post them on the Q&A speech bubble on the bottom of your screen. I have one question from Douglas Gook. And is it time for another walk of shame to all the related mining offices in downtown Vancouver?
That happens. That has happened and continues to happen. And one of the, I think, key strategies that organizations in support of communities have done over time is what you might call investor shareholder advocacy. So showing up not only in front of the corporate offices in downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver, but also to find your way into the AGMs, for example, as a shareholder, right? So buying in a share or a number of shares so that you can actually attend the AGM and then have the potential to speak. I think that's a strategy that's used. The Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada is one of the most, has one of the most massive of conferences every year in Toronto, and organizations and communities do exactly that, both outside of those meetings and inside when they can. I'm not sure how much it changes the perspective of those who are in those boardrooms, but it certainly is a way to draw attention to what's going on.
Dr. Nolin, Shiva Mohan, she is saying, first off, congratulations to you, Catherine, your co-editor and contributors. I think that this is a very important book, especially in the context of LAC being a kind of archetypal extractive space. The book appears to be a compendium of rich and varied perspectives that isn't one note short, but does the important feminist work of connecting different scales and voices from the people to politics across the space and time. I'm wondering, what were the parameters, if any, did you and your co-editor consider in imagining, the kind of disclosures you wanted to craft for your audience? Can't wait to get my hands on the book.
Well, thank you, Shiva. Thanks for reading that nice long comment that I really appreciate. Thank you, Shiva. Well, it's interesting. When I first had the idea of putting this kind of a collection together, it was really to reflect the kind of way in which we worked already. So it was to bring the voices of all of these range of people, from community members and lawyers and journalists and photographers and so on. These are the people that we do all our work with. And it's such a beautiful way to do work in a collaborative way. That's quite unique, I think, right? Many of us work as individual researchers, or we might be on a team, but maybe we're all, I don't know, environmental scientists, or we're all anthropologists. I think this diversity of voices and experiences is to be celebrated. I think, as Shiva points out, I think it is a feminist way of doing research, to highlight the voices of many people and see that as a strength. And so what I would say is there are about 30 contributors to this version. I am hoping that the book is so successful that we'll be asked to do a second edition and we can expand it to even more people, because we wanted both men and women, some younger folks, some people who'd been through the genocide, so people who were a little bit older. We wanted a range of both individuals and then from different perspectives, whether we work from the Canadian side of things or in the community. And so it was really a reflection of the people we work with, and hopefully we can expand it next time.
Thank you. Roger is asking, are there any good Canadian mining companies working in third world countries?
Well, that's a hard question there, Roger. Well, let's say this. I've always asked people who go off from, let's say, UNBC, who've taken courses with us, who've come on field courses to Guatemala with me, or to Peru and other places. And sometimes people go on and do work with mining companies or different kinds of work like that. And I always ask them, send me the examples of what's working well. We need to work from positive examples. I don't know if there are that many positive examples. We're seeing more and more. I think, when we first started looking into this in the early 2000s, this really wasn't well documented. And now it's well documented how Canadian mining companies operate in different countries in Africa, different parts of the Caribbean, from Haiti and other countries in the Caribbean, the Philippines, all through different parts of Latin America. What we're unfortunately seeing, even, I'm going to say this, Roger, maybe as a way to answer it more specifically. The Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada produced their own report several years ago now, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, looking into the connection between Canadian mining operations and violations and crimes and so on. And what their own report found was that of operations around the world, mining operations, that Canadian mining companies were the majority of cases where there were violations happening and crimes happening. And so they kind of quashed their own report and didn't publicize it, but somehow it got out. Of course, these things always get out. And so it showed that, even from within their own organization, trying to see the big picture, what they identified was that Canadian mining companies were the majority of those cases where there were crimes and violations. And that's not good. So their response when it became public was that, well, we're the majority of mining companies around the world, so the majority of violations will be with Canadian companies. And well, of course, that's not true. That doesn't make much sense. You could be the best operators. You could be the majority of mining companies and have the best record. So I think we need good examples. I think some new, things are changing. Hopefully there's change in the way in which companies operate, and the more pressure that investors like you and me and other people who have money to invest, or many of us who have jobs pay into the Canadian pension plan. The Canadian pension plan is invested in all of these mining companies. We can start putting pressure to not invest with companies with this kind of track record.
Thank you, Dr. Nolin. Lorraine Lavalley says, thank you for your brave work. Do any Canadian political parties talk about and commit to adopting a legislative framework to hold Canadian mining companies accountable?
Yeah, so there have been some NDP MPs who have made really, I think, good efforts at moving this discussion forward to creating some of these conditions on Canadian companies operating abroad to continue to have the benefit of diplomatic support and financial support for their work and so on. This hasn't moved very far. I think this became an issue with, not this election, the previous election. There was major lobbying of MPs that had Canadian of mining in their own regions within Canada to not support these kind of efforts. I think there's a lot of pressure to keep this from becoming our couple of cases that we document, to not let this be the way forward. Because once the dominoes start falling, I think it opens the door for more cases to be brought forward through the legal system. So we have the one case of Tahoe Resources that settled in British Columbia courts a couple of years ago for a situation where their head of mining security shot 6 men who were outside the mining site who were kind of in resistance to what was happening. And that was denied for a very long time. But eventually the pressure, the evidence, and I think the activism of people on the ground here and in Guatemala pushed them. And so they did settle that case. But the bigger case is connected to Hudbay Minerals in Toronto. And that's been an 11-year long struggle. But it is already precedent setting that it's being heard in Ontario courts. And well, we can be hopeful that it will go in the favor of the communities, and it would be a precedent for future accountability for other companies.
Thank you. Now, Lilsa North says, thank you for your great work and presentation. We have another question from Anonymous, and he's asking, or she's asking, why do you think the Canadian government remains unresponsive?
Well, it is, I don't know if they're unresponsive. They're responsive in the sense that they continue to support Canadian mining companies, this extractives approach to development, even in the face of major evidence of crimes and violations, because it is the position of the federal government that this is the strategy of moving forward, and is in full support of Canadian extractive industry that operates abroad. So it's not in contradiction to their policies. It is in contradiction to other policies that they have. So for example, a feminist approach to development, as the Trudeau government and the Canadian Foreign Affairs has a position called the feminist approach to development. This would be exactly counter to that, right? So we see that the approach and support for the companies outweighs the support for a feminist approach would be to support women and girls in mining affected communities, and understand that these kinds of situations are increasing impoverishment, increasing violence, increasing social conflict, and so on. But that doesn't outweigh the benefits they think of supporting the companies. There's a lot of money to be made, let's say that.
Thank you, Dr. Nolin. Glenn Thielman is asking, is there any scenario in which mining in Guatemala can be sustainable and guided by justice for Guatemalan peoples, or does it just need to stop?
Yeah, I would say our position would be that it just needs to stop. So maybe there's a scenario of, I don't know, many years down the line when it's when key positions like key approaches like free, prior, and informed consent are standard, right? That communities are consulted before any mining concessions are given out. When the justice system protects the community rather than attacks the community. There is so much that needs to change that there's at the position of every community that we've worked with is not one more inch, and the companies must go away. So there's very little discussion on the ground of something called sustainable mining. That might be some vision for 100 years down the line or something, I don't know. But that's not the conversation right now. The conversation is that it must stop. Communities must be allowed to say yes or no, to have a proper consultation before mining concessions are issued to companies. What's happened now is, for example, the Hud Bay case that we've been documenting now, that was previously owned by Inco, which was, a major, Canadian nickel mining company since 1960. And only this year has the Constitutional Court said that they have to actually go back and do a consultation. So it's been in the hands of Canadian companies since 1960. And only today, they're saying there should be something called a consultation. So I think we're very far away from something that might be called sustainable.
Thank you, Dr. Nolin. And I'm just gonna read a few messages from our chat. If you have any questions, keep posting them on the Q&A bubble. I have a message from Brooke, says, thank you so much, Catherine, keep going. From Chilan, thank you for this overview tonight. From Robin Curtis, fascinating but so sad. I have never heard of this. Very translatable to many things happening here. Such important work you're doing. And one thing we can do is learn and listen. Thank you so much. We have another comment from Sam Poon. Very important work, Catherine, and congratulations on your successful book publication and great presentation. From Farhan Ali, congratulations for the excellent work, Catherine. From Desine Hubbard, thanks to you and your team, Catherine. Important work and great presentation. I learned a ton.
Well, thank you, everybody, for those comments. There are lots of people I work with at UNBC and some students who've been in classes or been to Guatemala with me. So I appreciate everybody tuning in tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Nolin. And we have one more comment from Krista. Congratulations, Catherine. And from Brian, thanks for a great talk. Also, Zoe, this story is so important. I always learn something new. Thank you. From Johan Chavez, thank you for this presentation. Great work in South America. And one more question. Are there parallels between this mode of extraction in the global South and Indigenous communities in Canada?
Yes, for sure. I think that's one of the things that we've learned over time, that there are many parallels. There are quite a few differences, but many parallels. And one thing I've really benefited from is when we have students and delegates on our field schools and field courses and delegations who are from Indigenous communities here in British Columbia and across the country, really, who really see the connections and are learning from each other. I think one obvious thing is that many of the companies are operating in Guatemala, Honduras, Peru, and elsewhere are the same companies that are operating here in Canada. And they obviously act in different ways depending on the context, depending on the regulatory context, legal context, and so on. But the issue of lack of informed consent in many cases is foundational to across the globe, and Indigenous communities are standing up in resistance to that. And we don't have to look too far down the road in northern British Columbia here to see what's happening in communities with the Wet'suwet'en, with a pipeline, for example. It's not mining, but it's extractive industries operating in different ways. When the state is in full support of an extractive project and brings in, in the case there, it's police and snipers and you name it to ensure that project goes through. That's very reminiscent of what we see in the Guatemalan context. In Guatemala, the level of violence has maybe been on a larger scale because of lots of reasons. One being that it's really difficult to report on these matters. It's difficult to get into communities where this is happening, and it's quite dangerous, for example, for journalists and others to go in when these things are happening. I'm looking at the image behind you, Carlos, with the poster of the presentation, that image that James Rodriguez took during what was a state of siege that was implemented in around the communities around the Tahoe Resources Escobal mine back several years ago. And the image, it's kind of hard to see, but it's the police and military, different uniforms there, pulling aside people during, checks, and a state of siege really meaning that people couldn't leave their homes, that human rights defenders, community defenders were thrown in jail, people were brutalized and attacked. And, there are parallels. I think we have to be mindful that, the scale might be different, but this resonates, I think, through the whole hemisphere and beyond.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nolin, for answering all these important and interesting questions. And well, I want to thank Dr. Nolin again for this amazing information and presentation. It was great learning something new and interesting. Also, thanks to Jacqueline Baxter and Bailey Holloway for tech support, to our media sponsor, CBC Daybreak North, and everyone who was able to join us tonight as well. We're working on our November virtual adult speaker series. Watch for updates on our social media and our website. And well, for my part, I want to thank you so much again for joining us, and have a great night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. And Dr. Got to mention that with webinar format, unfortunately, when we hit end, we all just disappear and we don't get a debrief afterwards.
Okay.
So thanks so much for having us, and sorry for the awkward end there. And thank you everybody for
Take care.
Good night.
Bye.